We live in a fantasy world now. Reality has been destroyed.
This is the time that you really need to pay attention.
The probabilities are overwhelmingly on gold's side. That is the best environment to see gold increase its value.
Welcome to Palisades Gold Radio. I'm your host, Tom Bodrovics. Joining me today is Bob Moriarty, founder of 321gold.com, and he was also a Marine Corps fighter pilot in Vietnam. Bob, welcome back to the show.
Well, it's good to be back. We've got some interesting times.
Unfortunately, that seems like more of a curse than a blessing at this point, isn't it?
There's a good chance that's true.
So, Bob, when we look at the current financial landscape, give us a sense of how much capital has been destroyed since the Fed started raising rates. Let's take the crypto markets, for example.
It's funny you say that because I am not a crypto fan. There are between 10,000 and 20,000 cryptocurrencies, and we're told that you want to invest in them because they're rare. Anything that there's 10 to 20,000 of is not particularly rare. The crypto market has more fraud and manipulation involved across the board. There have been $2 trillion has literally evaporated since the first of the year. And that was, it wasn't real money, but it was semi-real money that people could have spent and didn't. And to give you an idea, to put it into perspective, if you go back to 2008 and the subprime crisis, more money has already been lost in the cryptocurrencies than in the subprime crisis. And at the end of the day, I think all of the cryptocurrencies are going to zero. A group of 1,600 computer scientists, economics professors got together and presented a paper to the Fed. And essentially, they said the whole crypto market is fraud and meaningless. And a lot of people are well aware that the World Economic Forum wants to go to a central bank digital currency, but it's not blockchain, and it will not be a cryptocurrency as people are investing. I believe, and I've been saying this since 2017, the cryptocurrencies are electronic beanie babies. It's a game of trying to sell to a bigger fool.
So as we talk about the Fed, what is the record of central bankers to actually be effective and achieve their goals? Should we believe that Jay Powell has control of what he thinks he does?
No. They're effectively at zero. It's one of those situations that the government getting involved has made things far worse than it would have been. If you go back to 1921, after World War I ended, and we transitioned from a military wartime economy to a peacetime economy, we had a depression. Now, it's a depression that 99% of Americans know nothing about because nobody teaches it. But the government did nothing. Okay, banks failed, people lost their homes, businesses closed, people lost their jobs, and the government did nothing. And it was over in 18 months. And then you go back to 1929 to 1932, when the government got involved, you got a depression that essentially went on for a 10-year period. It wasn't solved by the government. It was caused by the government. If we totally eliminated central banks, we would be better off.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we're going to get into some, let's say, unintended consequences of government policy a little bit later. But Bob, I want to get your take on how these moves can affect the bond market going forward from here.
The Fed has painted itself into a corner. The reaction of the government to COVID, of pouring gasoline onto a fire, 40% of all the money ever created in the United States, going back to 1792, 40% has been created in the last 2 years. When you do that, you're going to create an enormous amount of inflation. From an economist's point of view, the definition of inflation, it's not rising prices. From an economist's point of view, the true definition is increased money supply. And of course, increased money supply results in higher prices. So we've got that now. The price of food and fuel was going much higher even prior to the Ukraine-Russian war. And quite bluntly, the Fed has painted itself into a corner. If they raise interest rates, and they're probably going to raise interest rates, I think 1% this week, they blow the stock market up. If they go back to QE, which a lot of intelligent people are saying they're going to do, when they blow the stock market up, they're going to turn around and say, oh, we can't have that. So they'll flood the market with money again. And if they do that, they get hyperinflation. So your choice is you have a total stock market crash and the value of all assets plummets, or you have hyperinflation. Both obviously are bad choices. And quite bluntly, I think we're going to end up with both. We're going to have deflation and then we're going to have hyperinflation.
So we're going to have the worst of both worlds, probably because the Fed is so far behind the curve. Is that fair to say?
It's not correct to say behind the curve. The Fed is so clueless. Okay, when you dump excess money onto the economy, you're going to get an increase in prices. And if you've got an increase in prices, you can't keep interest rates artificially low. The EU just raised their central bank rate 0.5%. It's the first increase in 20 years. The EU's had negative interest rates for 10 or 15 years. You cause so much enormous distortion into a financial system that you're guaranteed something's going to break. So either the stock market breaks or the value of the dollar and the value of the euro breaks, or both.
So is that what you think it's going to take the Fed to pivot and get away from this hawkish narrative that they've been threatening the market with and raising interest rates here? Is the stock market crashing? And once that happens, that's when you think that they're going to pivot?
Yes, absolutely. We've already had a bond market crash. And quite bluntly, if you got 5 or 6 or 8 or 10% inflation or rising prices, and you've got 3% interest, you've got a guaranteed loss of principal every year. The European Union and the United States are debt-based systems. They painted themselves into a corner. There is no good way out. And strangely enough, Putin and the Chinese have gotten together. They're going to come up with an alternative currency. The debt-based system that's been in effect since 1492 is over. We just haven't recognized it yet. There is going to be a reset, and the economic power is going to shift about 5,000 kilometers to the east. We will go to a new reserve currency based on real resources, probably silver and gold.
Mm-hmm. So once we get that pivot, do you think the general market participants have learned a lot from that March 2020 environment and will jump in with both feet once they see that market turn, and really adding to the volatility?
The market participants right now are so clueless. They're like a bunch of fraternity kids on Saturday night with daddy's platinum credit card, and they're all drunk and have no idea what's going on. I would guess that probably something higher than 90% of investors and advisors in the United States have never been through a market crash. March of 2020 was interesting because it was catastrophic. And strange enough, that's something I had seen coming months in advance. There are some things you can say categorically because the answer is too obvious. You cannot have bonds paying 2% in a 8% inflation environment. The bonds are going to crash. The bond market's been in a roaring bull for the last 40 years. It's over. It's a guaranteed way to lose all your money. The stock market is only pumped up. It's like pumping helium into a corpse. And when it starts to rise, you say, hey, isn't that wonderful? Look what we did. But it's still a corpse.
Mm-hmm. So I've heard you say before that you don't worship gold, but it's the only form of honest money. So what in your mind makes it stand alone as an asset class here?
5,000 years of history.
Just as simple as that, right?
Well, it doesn't get any more complicated than that. You cannot have an honest economy without honest money. Now, most people don't realize this. You don't need a lot of gold for a gold system. The only role of gold in a gold system is to keep the government honest. You could have a gold-based economy with 1 ounce of gold. You take the ounce of gold, you take it to Washington, you put it in the White House on the president's desk, and anyone who takes the gold, their entire family, and going out to 6 generations either side, is executed. And anyone that wants to print money can. So you've got this situation where you want to have money that's better than gold. Now, is that possible? Can you have money that's better than gold?
I'm not sure, Bob.
Hang on. Let me ask you a question.
Mm-hmm.
You own any gold?
Of course.
How do you get it?
You have to buy it from somebody that has put the energy and time into mining it.
Let's keep it simple. How did you buy it?
With fiat currency.
Okay. So when you gave that fiat currency to somebody, he gave you gold. Did he value the currency more than the gold?
Yep.
Of course he did. Mm-hmm. Okay, there's nothing saying fiat currency can't have value. It just depends on the entire picture. Mm-hmm. Okay, but gold does such a wonderful job and has 5,000 years of history behind it. It just makes good money. But money can be salt. Money can be big round rocks. It can be plastic. It can be shells. It can be little tiny beads. You can buy islands with little tiny beads. Money can be anything, but money has to have one attribute. It has to have something that both the buyer and seller accept as value. Now, when you bought gold, you valued gold more than the currency, mm-hmm. but the guy who sold the gold to you valued the currency more than the gold. So there's nothing to saying that a currency can't be more valuable than gold. It can be.
Yeah, it's just the medium of exchange and the confidence in both of those different currencies or monies at the time, and how each of those people value it, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Mm-hmm. So, Bob, how do you quantify sentiment within the gold market? And can that hint towards a turning point for the metals?
Interestingly enough, you've honed too much into the issue. Sentiment moves every single market. Interest rates don't move markets. Currencies don't move markets. Wars don't move markets. The only thing that moves markets is sentiment. People either want something or they want to get rid of something. I use sentiment because it is an extremely accurate way of measuring turns. If you go back to December of 2015, January of 2016, the bullish miners' daily percentage got down literally to zero. Every single gold stock that they tracked was in a decline. When everybody wants to sell, that's when you want to buy. And when everybody wants to buy, that's when you sell. If you go back to April of 2011, at the very top in silver, the Sprott Silver ETF, and Eric Sprott was running around the entire industry talking about how wonderful this ETF was. Silver was $50 an ounce, but people who were buying Sprott Silver ETF were paying $65 an ounce for the same thing. And I wrote a piece and I said, okay, this is the top. It doesn't get any crazier than that. I happen to believe, and it's just an opinion, I am no more an expert or guru than anybody else is. I happen to believe sentiment is indicating that we're at a low for resource stocks right now. Certainly the sentiment for silver suggests that it's near low. The sentiment for gold says gold could go lower. However, we're in one of the most extremes of sentiment seen in the last 20 years. So I think for resources, it looks very attractive for the next 6 to 12 months.
Mm-hmm. As you mentioned, the sentiment in the miners is extremely negative here. So can we see a real violent upside recovery when that sentiment starts to turn, just the same way as we've seen it slide to the downside?
Yeah, of course. In 2015, 2016, from the middle of January until August, resource stocks were measured by the indexes were up 219%. In March of 2020, for the next 6 months, resource stocks were up 179%. All you have to do to make your retirement is figure out one of those turns once in your life. When you can make a 200% return in 7 months, you can make your retirement.
Mm-hmm. So, Bob, the conflict in Ukraine has had many consequences for the people there, but how damaging are the sanctions for the rest of the world?
Oh, a really great question. There's 195 countries in the world. The sanctions have hurt 194 countries.
And which is the only one, just to make it explicit, which is the only one that is excluded?
That would be Russia. And here's what's really funny. Have you ever done anything stupid in life? You ever done anything where you made a mistake and you realized that, gee, that was really stupid?
Of course, many times.
Everybody has. I wrote a piece on March 1st, as soon as the sanctions were announced, and I predicted that Europe had just committed suicide. The sanctions were going to be so dangerous to Europe that they were committing suicide. I had no idea that they would be so beneficial for Russia, but the Russian ruble went, I think, to a high of 140 to the dollar. Interest rates in Russia went to 20%. And since then, even though the dollar has just skyrocketed, the ruble against the dollar has gone to 60 or 62 to 1. So the best currency in the world for the last 4 months has been the Russian ruble because of the sanctions. But what I think is so beautiful is nobody in Europe has been willing to say, gee, why don't we eliminate the sanctions? If the sanctions hurt us and we're going to have our citizens freeze or starve, why don't we say forget the sanctions? Okay, that doesn't say anything politically. If they want to ship, the French shipped these $7 million Caesar artillery pieces to Ukraine. And you may think that's the most wonderful thing in the world. Now, certainly the Ukrainians think it's wonderful because they turned around and sold them to the Russians for $120,000. And the Russians think it's wonderful because they get all this free technology from France. And they only paid $120,000 for a $7 million gun. And I'm thinking, these people are all insane. Okay, if the sanctions don't work, why don't you eliminate the sanctions? And interestingly enough, the Chancellor of Germany is in Moscow right now talking to Putin, and he's on his knees begging for gas. And Putin said, well, gee, remember Nord Stream 2? Who was it that canceled Nord Stream 2? Let me think about this. God, it was the Germans. Why don't you talk to the... Oh, wait, you are the Germans. So if it wasn't so serious, it would be funny as hell. Now, I happen to be an anarchist. I don't hate government. I hate all governments exactly equally. I don't hate the American government or the Canadian government or the Russian governments. I just hate all governments. Governments are run by sociopaths. And to observe what the EU is doing now, we have a food crisis. So in the Netherlands, they're telling the farmers, you can't raise food anymore. And the farmers say, wait a minute, I mean, we've been doing this 15 generations. What do you mean you're going to take my farm away from me? Canada wants to do the same thing. The British government has been overturned. The Italian government has been overturned. There are riots in Poland. There are riots in Holland. There are riots in Ecuador. And in 2016, I wrote a book and I predicted the world's first worldwide revolution. And frankly, I think it's here. And believe it or not, all this goes back to the World Economic Forum. Climate change, Antifa, BLM, the COVID bullshit, the Ukraine war, monkeypox, the Taiwan issue. It's all part and parcel of this determination of Klaus Schwab and Bill Gates and George Soros to destroy the world's economy. And they're succeeding in destroying the world's economy. But believe me, people are waking up and saying, hey, wait a minute, we recognize the COVID thing is bullshit. We recognize we've been lied to about Ukraine, and BLM and Antifa is a bunch of nutcases. So we're in the midst of a giant shift. There is going to be a great reset, but it's not going to be the reset that Klaus Schwab had in mind. We're going to have a reset. You go back to the book, great book, The Fourth Turning. Mm-hmm. What most people don't realize is, yes, the authors of The Great Turning said you're going to have this very dangerous period of time, that's crisis. But they said you can go to a totalitarian form of government, or you can go to freedom. And quite bluntly, I think we're going to freedom. The Canadian truck drivers are the bravest people I've ever seen. The reaction of the Canadian government is the dumbest thing I've ever seen. a woman who is an important part in organizing that protest, which happened to be perfectly legal, is in jail. And they won't give her bond, and she is charged with a misdemeanor. They're letting people out of jail charged with murder, but because a person has taken a stance and done something perfectly legal in protesting stupidity on the part of the Canadian government, she's rotting in jail. The whole thing about the January 6th insurrection, there are hundreds of people being held in solitary confinement in Washington, D.C., charged with misdemeanors. I mean, how crazy does a political system have to get before it gets overthrown? And quite bluntly, we're there.
Mm-hmm. What do you see as the objective of the conflict in Ukraine? Is this really a war between Russia and NATO?
Yeah, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Here's what happened, and none of the mainstream media talks about it. In 2014, the United States sponsored a coup d'etat in Ukraine. The Donbass, the two regions in eastern Ukraine, said it's an illegal government. We don't want to be part of that. We want to be independent and make our own decisions. And they have been attacked since 2014 by the Ukrainian government. And what everybody forgets is Donbass is still Ukrainian. They just wanted to run their own government rather than do what the Ukrainian government's saying. NATO, I mean, Ukraine has been a part of NATO since 2014. Okay. Now, they're not officially part of NATO, but we've had American trainers there. We've had British trainers there. We've had French trainers there, had Canadian trainers there. They're equipped according to NATO standards. They've been trained according to NATO standards, and they're getting their butts kicked. Okay. So this is a war between Russia and 27 countries in NATO. However, Russia is not going to be defeated. And that's what the NATO nations need to wake up to. And quite bluntly, Russia's demands in the first place were quite reasonable. Russia wanted secure borders. And of course, when you got a president of the United States who doesn't give a damn about secure borders, that seems like kind of an unrealistic thing to ask for. But Russia wanted secure borders, and they said, we're willing to go to war to get it. Now, people forget this. I am not a pacifist. I am a warrior who is totally, absolutely against war. Nobody wins any war, but there are times you have to fight. And if I had to defend my country against a real enemy, I would grab a rifle, head for the front lines, and defend my country just as I tried to 50 years ago. But this is a useless war. NATO does not offer security to the countries in NATO. It actually gives them a lot of danger. Okay, it's like a fraternity that everybody thinks they need to belong to, but NATO is not a force for peace, it's a force for violence. And the war will destroy NATO, probably destroy the EU as well.
Do you think that this could develop into a conflict that spills outside of the Ukrainian territory? And what do you think the chances are that maybe China gets involved as well?
Well, China is involved to the extent that both Russia and China have recognized the West's debt-based system is non-functional. It doesn't work. It's not a good system to emulate. It's a bad system. So they've been accumulating gold for years. And I think there have been a lot of discussions behind the scenes as to what the world's reserve currency should be. I don't see China getting involved in Ukraine. Russia actually won the war in Ukraine in the first week. They managed to gain control of the sky. And if you control the sky, you control everything. It's been got total destruction. I think they've destroyed like 80 or 85% of the existing standing Ukrainian army. From a military point of view, they're going to be studying this for the next 50 years because this is such a lopsided war. NATO looked at it and said, look, we're spending $1.1 trillion a year on defense, and Russia only spends $66 billion. We're going to clean their clocks. And what they don't understand is NATO is a paper tiger. A British general said, and this just the last couple of weeks, said that we need to have a fighting army and we need to go fight Russia. When he said that, the British Army was 75,000 troops total. When I went into the Marine Corps in 1964, we had 190,000 Marines. 75,000. They got a police force in New York City that's bigger than that. So the NATO countries have been living in this never, never land where they believe in all the bullshit that they're being told by the Pentagon and these generals with, 50 lines of medals. They're all attendance medals, okay? They showed up in Botswana, so they got a medal for it. The world is going to change more in the next year or two than it has in the last 50 years. The enormous change from a political point of view and an enormous change from a monetary point of view. And actually, I think it's a very good thing. I think that literally Putin is fighting the evil of the World Economic Forum and stuff. The COVID thing, I mean, you don't even want to get it started there. That's so evil. The government lied about everything.
Kind of along those lines, Bob, we talked about how the government got involved and in a lot of ways made the Great Depression a lot worse than it should have been because of their intervention. We talked about the sanctions that they put on Russia, and this just brings the point up that everything ends up being a trade-off and there are consequences to every action. So, I wanted to get some of your perspective on the effect of the lockdowns.
The COVID lockdown and forcing on children are as close to a war crime as you will ever get. We have stolen 2 years from the lives of young children, and it was all for nothing. Okay, there was no benefit from it whatsoever. There were no statistics. There were no studies that said it was a good idea. Everything said it was a bad idea, and it was done anyway. And the important for your listeners to understand is COVID was not a health issue. There was nothing in it that was done for health reasons. The mask didn't work. The lockdown didn't work. Forcing people to shut their businesses down didn't work. The social distancing didn't work. And for damn sure, the vaccines didn't work. But to give vaccines to young children, I think one of the statistics I've seen lately said a vaccinated child between 10 and 16 has a 35,000% higher chance of getting myocarditis. Okay. Now that's staggering. When you look at the numbers, first of all, kids were never in danger from COVID. COVID was a bad flu. That's all COVID ever was. And it was a bad flu that was created by the United States in Wuhan The United States paid for the gain of function research. Fauci lied about that, and he got caught, and nobody cared. But children were not at risk from COVID, so doing anything to children was a bad idea. And I think one of the statistics that I've seen recently was 70% of 10-year-old children didn't meet reading standards for 10-year-old children. That is catastrophic, okay? Children need to learn to read at a certain age. I mean, I'll give you an example. I have issues all the time with women here, all of whom want me to speak French. And I said, look, I'm 75 years old. I cannot learn a language at 75. And somebody said, well, if you learn 3 words a day, you can be colloquial in a year. And I said, well, that's interesting because I lose 3 words a day. Okay, I'm not even going to be colloquial in English. But what was done to children and what's being done to children is an absolute crime. I totally agree. COVID is the biggest medical crime in world history, but I hope there's a very special place in hell for the bastards who are giving shots to children.
You know, Bob, I remember speaking with Doug Casey and him saying that the pandemic lockdowns will lead to climate change lockdowns. And of course, like you just mentioned, you're currently in France, where I saw a headline last week that because of the heat wave, outdoor events and public gatherings were canceled. So do you see this as a symptom of governments exerting more and more power over their populace?
Yes and no. Quite bluntly, when you got that kind of heat, and that was real heat, okay, canceling the outdoor activities is a good idea. But if you go into COVID, or not COVID, into lockdowns because of climate change, one of the things that I would hope your viewers would recognize, and I saw a lot of it here, they took weather maps and they put the temperatures on the weather maps. Now, in the past, the weather maps were all green. But in the last 2 weeks, the weather maps are now red.
With the same temperatures on them.
No, with lower temperatures. It's what's so funny. They changed the color of this. Governments all want power, okay? That's what this is all about, is power. When you get a guy like Bill Gates, you can go to YouTube and you can watch the video. Bill Gates brags about making 1,000% return on his investments in vaccines. Now, there is something obscene about a guy worth $50 or $60 billion who brags about making 1,000% return on anything. At some point in time, why don't you say, I've got everything I need. I don't need more. But the whole Davos thing, the whole World Economic Forum thing is this 1,500 of the rich and powerful and beautiful, and they want more and more and more power. Lord Acton in 1871 said power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And we're in a situation where the government, because of computers, wants more and more and more control over people. Now, anybody that's familiar with my website recognizes I don't ever write about major mining companies. I write about juniors. I don't write about the big companies, because I've observed in my 75 years that the bigger the organization, the dumber it gets. You can have good government on a local basis, but by the time you go to state basis or federal basis, you get abject stupidity, and you get these psychopaths in power who are not interested in anything other than increasing their power. The EU reaction to the sanctions is a perfect example. The sanctions hurt the EU. And nobody's saying, why don't we get rid of the sanctions? The war hurts the EU because of the cost of energy and the cost of fertilizer and the cost of food. And nobody's saying, why don't we see if we can end this war? You cannot name a single political power in the world who's saying, we need to have peace in Ukraine. I would love to have peace in Ukraine. It's an easy thing to do. All they have to do is listen to what Putin wanted in the first place and ask themselves, is it reasonable? And what he was asking for quite largely was reasonable, and he's going to get it in the end anyway. Mm-hmm. So we're in a situation in which the fourth turning is here. We're in the crisis stage. I'm not sure if it's going to last a year longer, 2 years longer, or 5 years longer. But at the end of the day, I think sanity will prevail. We're just going through the bad period right now.
Well, Bob, I think that's a pretty good spot to wrap up today's interview. We sure touched on a lot there, and I think it gives our listeners a lot to think about if they're not already aware of a lot of the topics that we've covered today. Why don't you tell everybody the best places to find you and more of your writing?
If they go to 321gold.com at 321 Energy, I've been running 321 Gold for 22 years. And we cover economics, and we cover mining, and we can cover even things like war. But I've done a lot of interviews lately because the mainstream media is now just utter fiction. If you want to know what's going on, watch the mainstream media and realize that the truth is exactly the opposite of what they're saying. So it's literally sites like yours that people need to go to get reality.
Couldn't agree with you more, Bob. Thanks so much for your time and your perspective today. Really appreciate it.
Okay, good deal. Good interview. I appreciate the time.
This podcast is for general informational purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be taken as investment advice. Guests on this show are not compensated for their appearance. Listeners are urged to educate themselves and make their own decisions. Do not base any investment decisions on the information contained. To view our full disclaimer, please visit our website.